Hello, everyone, and welcome to the January 2025 UCLA Tarjan Center Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Jessica Estevio, Director of Training for the Tarjan Center, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. As you know, the recent LA County wildfires have caused incredible stress and devastation, deeply impacting our community. We stand together with those affected and remain fully committed to supporting our community during this challenging time. We also recognize the profound challenges and disruptions caused by displacement, particularly for individuals with disabilities and their families who also face additional barriers during emergencies like this. We've been inspired by the outpouring of support from across UCLA, Los Angeles, and beyond. For information on mental health resources, you can check our social media. We're also in the midst of organizing some free online support groups in the coming weeks. So do stay tuned and please reach out with any questions or needs. A couple reminders before we get started. For captions in English on your Zoom toolbar, please click Show Captions. For captions in languages other than English, on your Zoom toolbar, look for Show Captions and click on the up arrow, then select Translation at the top and click My Caption Language to choose your preferred language. If you'd like to see English and your preferred language, you can click on Show Original and Translated Captions. Please enter your questions for our speaker into the Q&A throughout the talk, and we'll facilitate discussion at the end of the presentation. Also complete our evaluation survey to provide feedback and suggestions for future lectures. The link for the evaluation survey will be sent in the chat today, as well as in a follow-up email this week. Lastly, after today's lecture at 1 to 1:30, we'll have our UCLA Tarjan Center Research and Resource Exchange. This is an optional opportunity for our attendees to learn about research studies and community resources from our faculty and staff. Dr. Catherine Lord, George Tarjan Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry, will be sharing a few research opportunities, and our audience can ask questions and learn how to get involved. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our wonderful speaker for today. Dr. Alan Martino, whose pronouns are he, him, is an assistant professor in the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary. His main research interests include critical disability studies, gender and sexualities, feminist and critical disability studies theories, and qualitative and community-based research, particularly participatory and inclusive methodologies. His work has been published in multiple journals, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Sexuality and Disabilities, and Sexualities, as well as in edited volumes on disability and sexuality studies. He leads the Disability and Sexuality Lab at the University of Calgary. In recognition of his contributions, he was awarded the 2024 Early Investigator Award by the Canadian Sociological Association and the 2024 Early Career Award by the Sociology of Sexuality section of the American Sociological Association. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Alan Martino, who will be presenting Cripping Intimate Relationships, the experiences of 2SLGBTQ+ adults with developmental and/or intellectual disabilities. All right, I'll hand things over to Alan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the warm welcome. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. I would like to start always with my accessibility statement. And what I mean by that is that I would like to extend the invitation for you to use any space you're in a way that feels right to your body, to your mind, in a way that feels accessible to you. So if you want to move around, stand up, lie down, put your feet up, go out, come back in, tweet, take notes, or enjoy time with your non-human animal companion, feel free to. I'm a big Mariah Carey fan, so you will see some GIFs from Mariah Carey, and I think this is the way that she feels very comfortable. I would also like to acknowledge the situation that is happening, I know, in Southern California, and I'd like to recognize the ongoing fires that are happening and how it's affecting countless communities. So my thoughts are with those impacted by these devastating events, and I hope to express my solidarity and hope for the safety of all of those who have been affected by it. I'll just very briefly share how I even got to this research topic because that's the number one question I get. What got me interested in looking at this intersection of disability and sexualities? I would say two main experiences. One, having a sibling with a physical impairment who really showed to me not only the multiple ways in which our social world has so many barriers, especially physical barriers for him, but most of all, the level of discomfort that family members, including siblings and parents, can feel when it comes to addressing this part of life. As a family, we felt so comfortable advocating and supporting him and working as allies when it came to employment, education opportunities. But when it came to the topic of intimate relationships and sex and pleasure, then we kind of felt very uncomfortable with it. And we just didn't know or had the supports or the resources to feel like we were doing a good job at it. So big part of doing this work is coming from this experience of being a sibling and really wanting to make a difference and trying to create better supports, especially for people with lived experience and family members, caregivers. I myself have invisible disabilities as well, and that certainly shapes the work I do, how I work with my students and try to mentor them through academia. And, I come from this intersection of being proudly queer and crip. And I look at this pictures of me as a child, and it's just so cool to see now me doing this type of work in terms of trying to understand the experiences of 2SLGBTQ folks who are living with developmental or intellectual disabilities. Just a quick note on terminology. So as you saw on the title of this presentation, we have the term cripping. For me, to crip is not just a noun, but it's really a verb. It's a form of practice. And in disability studies, we talk about this term as one that has been reclaimed by some people with disabilities, right? As a from a historically offensive word, trying to use it and flip its meaning and use it as a way to reclaim empowerment and reclaim pride and solidarity. So for me, when I use the term CRIP, it's really about how do we reclaim disability, not as a tragedy or simply a medical component, but as an identity, as part of our lives, as a form of diversity of human minds and bodies that should be celebrated and welcome in our society. And by cripping, I'm treating this as a practice of disruption. Let's disrupt what we think sexuality can look like. For example, by cripping sexualities, we're talking about challenging the very narrow and I would say boring able-bodied assumptions about what counts as sex, for example, or what sex and relationships should look like or feel. It's about instead creativity and openness in terms of learning from disabled people themselves about how can we expand the menu of options in terms of sexual expression. And I'll give you some examples to really make this more concrete for you. I started doing this research when I was still back in my undergraduate years, and I had a chance to work as a volunteer in a service provider organization. And it was in the arts program where we had a lot of improvisation exercises on stage. It was an organization providing services to folks with intellectual disabilities. And in one of the particular improvisation scenes that we were working on, a young man with Down syndrome was on stage and he said, "Love is natural. We all love." Now, that sentence was actually welcomed by the audience. And I think I even heard someone say, "Oh," and the scene continued. However, 2 minutes later, that's when the same young man says, "Sex, that's what I want." Now, that sentence actually changed the energy in the room completely. I could see some of the support workers in the room staring at each other, not knowing what to do with that. Some people were giggling, some people were quiet and awkward. And it felt like ages until one of the support workers jumped in and actually said, "Isn't the weather beautiful today?" and stopped the scene right there. To me, it just didn't feel right to stop the scene. It kind of reinforced this idea that people with disabilities are not allowed to talk about something that is also important in their lives. So the topic of sex and sexuality was treated as an elephant in the room that we kind of all wanted to ignore. right, in that space. And I was thinking there must be a better way to do this that is not just about shutting down conversations about sexuality and sex, but allowing people to express their desires as well in safer spaces. We know that the intersection of disability and sexualities remains a taboo topic. Even though we have journals like Sexuality and Disability now, or we have courses in some universities now that focuses on this intersection, you would still be surprised with the number of service providers, for example, who still tell me that sexuality is not a relevant topic, or that there are more important topics to talk about, or they just don't have anything to say about it. In a few occasions, I even had service providers who hang up on me as soon as I use the word sexuality. So there's still a lot of awkwardness around the topic and a lot of taboo around it. And part of it, I think, is because in our cultural imaginary, there are two sorts of dominant controlling images. And controlling images is this language from Patricia Hill Collins, a sociologist, where she talks about how certain marginalized social groups, their sexualities get, basically defined into two extremes. In the case of people with intellectual disabilities, especially, we see this case where they're either seen as childlike and innocent and thus desexualized, or they're seen as having excessive sexualities that require control, surveillance, and overprotection or protection. The problem with this approach that one, it doesn't allow for complexity in people's lives, right? And also, as one young man with intellectual disability once told me about this, he said, no matter where you end up in those opposite ends, you're screwed and not in a good way. It eliminates the complexity of the lives of people with disabilities when you have these two extremes. The other component that I think is very important to highlight right away, which is often another area of question that I get, is around the question of vulnerability. We know that people with developmental and especially intellectual disabilities are sometimes 3 to 4 times more likely to experience sexual abuse in their lives compared to non-disabled people. I mean, the numbers are scary and awful when you see the estimates in terms of forms of abuse. We know that abuse tends to be underreported. We know that people with disabilities tend not to be believed when they do come out and talk about those cases. So it is important to acknowledge this vulnerability that does happen here. However, I think it is also important not to individualize the issue and make it about individuals only. This should be seen as a structural issue. So my colleague, for example, Andrea Holomatz, talks about this when she says that vulnerability can also be a structural issue. What I mean by that is, for example, by not giving people with disabilities access to sexuality education, we're not giving people the tools to make informed choices and decisions in their intimate lives. So we make people more vulnerable by denying opportunities to access sex education and sexuality relevant information. So what we need to consider is the recurring ways in which disabled people are also made more vulnerable, not simply because of who they are, but also because we don't allow people with intellectual disabilities a lot of times to practice making decisions on their own. I talk to quite a few people who don't even get to choose what to wear or what to eat every day. How do we expect people to make, in quotes, good choices about their intimate lives? We also need to start from the perspective that sexual expression is a human right. And Mariah Carey is supporting this idea here. One key vocabulary that I would give that I have found very useful for articulating this in my work is the notion of intimate citizenship. It's a term coined by Ken Plummer, a sociologist in the UK, and he defines us as our rights to choose what we do with our bodies, feelings, identities, relationships, genders, eroticisms, and representations. For people with disabilities, unfortunately, what we see on the ground happening in practice is that intimate citizenship is not respected. It's very, very often absent in the lives of people with disabilities in our communities. Even though sexual expression and intimate citizenship are components that we see highlighted in the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. When service providers come to me asking for support and advice, around disability and sexuality, what I find very interesting is that the request is usually providers asking me to come and train disabled people on how to be sexual and romantic, in quotes, the right way or the healthy way. But often my strategy is certainly saying, yes, we do have resources. We can share that with folks that you work with. We can, teach folks a little bit of some vocabulary that might be useful or some red flags and things like this. But I think the juiciest part of the work that I do is really flipping the script, is asking instead, what can we learn from disabled and queer sexualities and from people with lived experience themselves? So when these requests come to me, my response is usually, I will shut all this shit down. Let's flip the script here. Let's think about how much wisdom and knowledge and creativity there is also among people with disabilities who are finding ways to remain sexual. So one of the questions that I certainly would pose out there already is what counts as a healthy sexuality? And what I mean by that is that I'm often asked to teach people with disabilities to, how to do healthy sexuality. But I think there is a tricky part here in the work we do. Through various interviews and various research projects I've done, I found that people with intellectual disabilities are taught a very different version of healthy sexuality at times. For example, a healthy sexuality means only monogamy, only heterosexuality forms of love and intimacy, and most importantly, very few, if any, kind of forms of social sexual encounters. So people sometimes are being told that not having sex is what counts as healthy sexuality. Being told sometimes by caregivers, parents, or even service providers. The trouble with this too is that for folks who supposedly fail to do healthy sexuality, they can really land into trouble. I've seen people who land into trouble for kissing their partners on the cheek, holding hands, things that for non-disabled people would be seen as pretty harmless if we think about it. I learned from men and women with intellectual disabilities that being a good man is what they learned, or a good woman, involves never touching your intimate partner, even if you've been together for over a decade, much less having sex. So a healthy sexuality for a lot of people, the way we teach them, is that it's grounded in celibacy. And if there is some kind of form of sexual expression that is allowed, the only form is solitary forms of sexual expression, like masturbation. And I have lots and lots of research data supporting this. So one of the main challenges that I've seen is that even for those who try to follow these dominant scripts of healthy sexuality, they can get punished for engaging in very harmless forms of sexual expression. Like I mentioned, simply holding hands or kissing other people, including their own partners, can land them into trouble. So when we think about healthy sexuality and teaching people with disabilities about what counts as healthy sexuality, I think we need to be a little cautious. What are we teaching people with disabilities about what counts as a healthy sexuality? Who gets to decide what is healthy or not? For example, if I meet someone at a party and I want to hook up on a Friday night and go to their place, is it healthy or unhealthy? Who gets to decide, right? We know this is a common practice among quite a few university students. The same thing can be said about the notion of sexual health. We need to approach it also very carefully. The notion of sexual health has become such a buzzword across multiple spaces, including sometimes in service delivery. And I think on one hand, it has been a great thing because it has opened up conversations about sex and sexuality in spaces that maybe wouldn't have happened, right? So it really serves, as a quote by Gursky and colleagues says, sexual health as an entry point allows engagement not only with the health sector, but with programmers, policymakers who may not otherwise be immediately sympathetic to the importance of rights and pleasure. So on one hand, it achieves something very important. But where I wanted to kind of be cautious here a little bit is that what we find in the literature is that most of the work produced under the term sexual health continues to focus mostly and sometimes only on the negative aspects of sexuality. It's only about sexually transmitted diseases, unplanned pregnancies, abuse, and violence. Now, folks, if I could see your faces right now, we all know we're not seeking intimate relationships or hookups because of STIs or those things. We're seeking because we want love, intimacy, touch, positive aspects of relationships and sexual encounters. So we need to be very careful, again, how we are using these terms. Are we encompassing everything that should be included in this under this label of sexual health? A friendly note, I will be using for a couple minutes a F word that rhymes with duck. So I swear it's for a purpose. So when we look at research from the sociology of sexualities, sexuality scholars have also posed some really critical questions. For example, my colleagues Wasco and Plant ask, where is the passion, the heat, the sweat, and other bodily fluids? Where's the silliness, the humor, the goofiness? Where is the intimacy, the playfulness, and the pleasure and the eroticism? And where on earth is the fucking? Especially when it comes to disability and sexuality, we spent so much more talking about the negative aspects of sexuality that we rarely address these kinds of positive aspects of sexuality. So I echo research from the last 2 or 3 decades in disability studies that have talked about what some have called this missing discourse of pleasure among people with disabilities. We need more opportunities to talk about sex, desires, pleasure, and plainly fucking. So a missing discourse of pleasure that continues to exist. As Mike Gill from the United States appropriately notes, pleasures of sex for people with disabilities are lost in discourses of abuse and disease prevention. And when I talk to people in the community about their sexual intimate lives, they're not talking just about like STIs and unplanned pregnancies. Actually, what people are really interested in talking about and learning about is how to form relationships, how to make sense of their identities, how to make sense of who they are, what to talk about on a first date. Those are the questions that I actually get more often. So a lot of participants in my studies have felt very discouraged from engaging forms of sexual expression. And part of it is the consequence of these negative messages about sexualities that are constantly being reinforced. A perfect example of this is Christopher, a man with intellectual disabilities in his 40s who says, sometimes they make it scary. This is inappropriate, or this is wrong, or this is illegal, or this is dangerous. This isn't fun anymore. I don't want to do it, have sex. It's not going to be any good. And I mean, it is understandable to feel this way when you only hear about abuse, getting in trouble, and that's the only language you hear about sexuality. There's also a huge need for more intersectional work in what we do. And what I mean by that is that people with disabilities are not just a disability label, as we know. So we need to understand people's lives as being affected by various social identities, including race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, social class, and so on. Of course, doing this intersectional work can be kind of challenging. One of the challenges that I have encountered in doing this work around gender and sexualities has been that sometimes people have reacted by saying things like, come on, Alan, you're telling us that people with disabilities are sexual, and now you're telling us that there are sexualities in the plural, like multiple sexual identities? Yes, we do. People with disabilities have the same diversity of, gender identities and sexualities here. So one of the challenges that I face is that some people are saying, aren't you going just too far now by talking about this intersection? Yet, what we know from the literature is that people at this intersection of queerness and disability are sometimes infantilized in ways and discredited in ways that are seen as, for example, being told that it's just a phase towards heterosexuality or a last resort. Or when we see two people of the same kind of gender with intellectual disabilities holding hands, we say that they're just friends, even though we might know that Mike and Tony are having sex and hooking up in the back of the building. Sometimes even the notion that disabled youth and disabled people have sexual desires and can be sexual and identify as queer is inconceivable to some people in our communities still, including some service providers. The challenge is that folks at this intersection, they have to navigate multiple systems of oppression and inequality, from ableism to homophobia and transphobia. And to make things even more challenging, participants and people in the literature have often cited how they feel invisible and invalid or undervalued, both in disability spaces and queer communities. So a lot of people say, I don't have a space where I can be myself. Even as a researcher, when I've gone through the ethics process through my institutions to get ethics approval to do this work, there have been multiple occasions that I have been discouraged from asking participants about other parts of their life, like sexual orientation or race. And part of it, the assumption was that disability and disability diagnosis or label was the only identity that mattered to participants. But as my research today will show, actually, disability is one of the aspects that shape people's lives. So for this particular project, I conducted 31 semi-structured interviews with people who self-identified as having a developmental and or intellectual disability, and who also identify as being a part of 2SLGBTQ plus community. And we really highlighted the plus part of it. We want it to be as broad as possible in terms of the kinds of gender and sexual identities included. We engaged in a thematic analysis of the data using in vivo, and we did multiple rounds with my research team to make sure we're not missing anything. Look at this. When we look at the demographics of our research among 31 participants, look at the variety of gender identities that people have reported already. Or if we look at the sexual identity, for example, look at also the variety of sexualities that are represented in our sample. That totally challenge the notion that people with disabilities just cis heterosexual. So for me, as I do this work, it was very important to take a CRIP lens to it. And what I meant by that is that it was about highlighting challenges, but also highlighting the ways in which people are transforming sexualities and challenging normative understandings of it. So rather than trying to assimilate and come as close as possible to normative forms of sexualities, we're trying to understand how people with disabilities are introducing new forms of what it means to be sexual. For example, in the literature, we have cases of people who found new erogenous zones in the body. So it's about disruption. Yes, there are barriers, and participants did talk about it. So for example, Priscilla says, when you have a developmental disability, people think you don't know what you're talking about. Or when you say, I'm bisexual or gay, whatever, they think you don't actually know what it means. So that erasure of a queer identity. Or the question of inaccessible spaces. Phoenix, 33 years old, says they, non-disabled queer people, think ramps, accessible elevators, successful. We're doing the bare minimum. But there's other levels to it, like carpet is the hardest thing ever to push a wheelchair on. It's horrible, and she laughs. So again, accessibility is not just about ramps and elevators, it's also about the lighting, the smells, the space, the sounds, and everything else. Participants also talked about a lack of access to communities that were accepting, that actually welcome them. For example, Gabriel, 34 years old, says, queer spaces are predominantly white and able-bodied, like a certain beauty standard and all those things, which, people with disabilities may or may not fit that criteria for queer communities, especially as a romantic partner. So people who just didn't feel like they fit in to the standards or the scripts of this particular kinds of queer spaces. Morgan, 26 years old, also talks about this lack of a community. I think honestly, like I had to have very rarely inhabited those spaces. I don't really go out to like bars or nightclubs or anything like that. And so I just kind of avoided them because I couldn't like safely fall back into some expectation of me. Here, referring one to the question of the space and accessibility with sounds and lights and everything, but also the scripts of how to navigate the particular spaces that also have their own kinds of sets of scripts. So people are talking about certainly the challenges, the negative aspects in their experiences, but people are also talking about amazing experiences of having pleasurable sex and sexual experiences. For example, Virginia, a young trans woman with an intellectual disability, was someone who talked very comfortably about sexual pleasure. She says, I do watch porn, I'm not going to lie. I watch it on my phone now every night. I pretend that I'm the girl with that black guy, and I pretend that my boyfriend is fucking me. It's fun, and I go there. And I touch my breasts, and I'm watching. With hormones, my breasts got so tender because they're growing. So I'm massaging. Sometimes I use my dildo because it's comfortable. When you first get used to anal sex, not everybody likes it. It's sore, it's uncomfortable. Like, I don't want it. But for me, it feels good using the toy and making sure you clean up after yourself and watching pornography of a black man having sex with a white woman. Chelsea, a woman with an intellectual disabilities in her early 60s, also told me about how she really enjoyed having one night stands with men in the community. And she actually even explained to me her approach. She said that once she encountered a man who she was interested in, especially men from a particular racial group, she would simply go to them and say, You wanna fuck? That's what I would say. She has certainly been successful in her approach as she has found people for hookups. Another example is Nicholas. Actually, Nicholas makes a really interesting reference to the Bible when he talks about, his marriage to a woman with an intellectual disability and meeting other couples for sex. He talks about his swinging lifestyle as, quote, a forbidden fruit that you just want to eat. What I also like to highlight in terms of cripping and transformation and disruption is that participants challenge kind of normative understandings of how disability affect relationships and sex. For example, Benjamin offers a really cool example. He says, disability, can make things fun. We're known for like special interests and things like that. And so a lot of time when I find myself, especially with like a new partner, they're always like, wow, you seem like very educated in A, B, and C. And they're like, I've never like experienced that before. So as Benjamin highlights here, having a disability does not always equate, right? Negative experiences and negative outcomes in relationships, but it can actually be something that almost works as a sexual capital. Gabriel also talks about this as he says, it's interesting because in my current relationship, my partner has an invisible disability and has a visible disability and have an invisible disability. So we're navigating each other's disabilities, what will happen in intimate moments. So a very unique dynamic, but I really am learning a lot about myself and himself too. One of the things that participants talk to very often is how disability has forced them to be much more straightforward about what actually worked for them and their bodies and their minds, what parts of the body felt good, which didn't, what kinds of sexual practices felt comfortable or did not feel comfortable. And as I listened to those stories, I just kept thinking, this should be a lesson to everyone, disabled and non-disabled. All relationships and sexual encounters would absolutely benefit from having more open conversations about what feels right and safe and comfortable. Benjamin also here shares, as autistic people, we usually go into situations being like overly prepared. I go into every situation like very ready and clear and concise and things like that, like including sexual experiences as well. But for other people, it's maybe not. And so I've had like very positive feedback in that area with it, which I think is hilarious. So as people were encountering non-disabled people as sexual partners, they actually found that people appreciated that open conversations, those open conversations about sex and sexuality. It improved the quality and the pleasurable aspect of their sexual lives. People were able to actually find and build vocabulary to articulate what they like. Phoenix also shares this piece as saying, my communication is really important between my partners and I. One of my partners right now, who I've been with for 5 years, actually their main love language is touch. And I'm encouraging them to find like a cuddle buddy because I think that's so important for them to get their needs matched. Or Sally, who says, like, we end up having a lot of very detailed conversations with one another, just like iron out all the details and just like clearly like establish like each other's intentions and stuff like that. The emotional states. Again, that communication piece, which I believe everyone could benefit from. Or even the point of humor. Phoenix shares, my sensory profile is really complex. Laughter. I like very particular touch at very specific times. And by my own standards, like hate to draw the comparison of like being a cat, but it's like, it's exactly like being a cat. And she laughs. I had another participant who actually said, I don't understand why we cannot tell jokes during sex. And indeed, why can't we? Why do we have this assumption that the scripts of sex involves serious sex, spontaneous, with no preparation needed? We assume that there is a finishing line, and that's what we usually ask each other, did you finish? Why do we have this kind of scripts about how sex and sexuality have to unfold? In the case of my participants, instead, they were messing up with the scripts, and I love that. They're talking about starting from the end, starting from, ending from the beginning, just changing things around, changing how sex is understood. And it's been amazing to do this work out in the community because I find so many examples of people finding ways around the barriers that exist. For example, the couple that I talked about that wanted to keep active swinging lifestyle and meet other couples, what they learned is that a lot of the communication to find other couples is done through texting. But other couples would find that their spelling and grammar had some errors and it seemed a little different. So that would discourage other partners to join them. Their way around it was that they found a neighbor who actually is willing to spell check and grammar check the messages before they're sent to other people. How genius is that? Another amazing example that I like to share is the dick pic. I mean, dick pics, right? Like those nude pictures of our penises being shared online with other people. Whether we like or not, they come our way and find us. But what happened was a young man with a physical impairment who really wanted to take a dick pic to use in online dating. He couldn't do it himself, but the professionals in the house, the direct care work team, were able to create a concoction equipment that allowed him to place his phone. They gave him the privacy, gave him the space to take the pictures that he wanted. They came back and unhooked everything, and the day just went by. Again, challenging the ideas that dick pics are this spontaneous things that you just go in front of a mirror, take it, and send it. So we have so many amazing examples of people who are already cripping sexualities, transforming, disrupting. Finally, I think we need to make room for more desire-based research within this body of work. We focus so much on damage and negative aspects. How about asking people and allowing people to desire and to imagine new ways of being and doing things? For example, when we ask participants about how can we make queer spaces better, people certainly had lots and lots of ideas and lots of desires of what they wish that those spaces could look like. For example, Jill says, I would want to meet in places that are like sensory friendly, like a sensory friendly place where there's like good lighting, not really too much noise, and you can just kind of hang out. Similarly, other participants said very similar things that they would like spaces like, for example, libraries, places where they could go and just a coffee shop, quieter, or that are physically accessible. They also talked about how, as queer people, we need to do better at inviting people with disabilities into these spaces. So this brings me to the last part here, the Disability and Sexuality Lab. One of the things that I really appreciate about the work we do is that one of our values, first of all, is that nothing is taboo topic, right? So we are community-based, which means that all the work we do are all based on requests that comes from people with lived experiences, support workers, service providers, caregivers, siblings. We get these requests and we use the resources we have with research to create tools and recreate knowledge that can be shared out there. For example, one of the requests that came from caregivers was that they were telling us, my son is using those online dating apps and keeps sending these emojis, and I don't know what that means. So we created a social media, campaign teaching people, both caregivers, but also people with disabilities about what these emojis mean. As you'll notice here, we don't sugarcoat it. We don't use words like PP or infantilizing words. We use the real words that we should be using to talk about sex education and sexuality in general. But we still try to keep it light and informative so more people feel a little less embarrassed and a little less of a taboo to talk about this. Another one, might be a new word for folks here in this room, it's sexident. Sexident is a mix of the words sexy and accident. It's like an injury that occurs during sex, like skinning your knee or bumping your head. As you can see, we always have some visuals. We have very short length, sentences. We try to make it concrete with examples. It's about simply giving people some vocabulary and information. Even the term zombing is something that people are asking us, what does this mean? Can you create something for us to explain this? Or one of my favorites, what do we mean by friends with benefits? This one, the funny, and even though the answer supposedly is B, a lot of people are like, A and C also would qualify, and I would love friends like that too. And again, butt plug was another request that came from someone with lived experience that wanted to understand, like generally speaking, what is this? And we explained that it's a sex toy, how it works. For some people, it feels good. For some people, it doesn't work. And that's absolutely okay. Another word of the week, doppelganger. And I must say, doing this work, I learned so much all the time because sexuality and our sexual lives are constantly changing, the ways we connect with each other, the language we use. So I'm constantly in the process of learning, and I'm very grateful for being connected with a community that teaches me so much. My students working with me also teach me so much. My favorite resource that we created, and since then we have print out all the emojis and their meanings, and we created almost like a game that people can play. We got amazing feedback, both from people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, but even from caregivers who were like, I had no idea that tacos could mean this. I would never look at tacos the same way again. But again, giving people that information, the tools. Okay, I'm going to stop there so we have lots of time for questions and comments. But thank you so much for following along, folks. And here's my contact information if you want to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that wonderful presentation. I can certainly say that's the first time that the F word's been used during this lecture series. But that's part of what I appreciate about your work is that it's very real and so important to be discussing these things as they apply to our communities, the people that we work with, our families. This is real life. Right? And so I really appreciate the work that you do and how accessible you're making educating our communities. All right, another reminder for our audience to continue to submit your questions for Alan into the chat. I think I'll go ahead and start us off while everyone is continuing to type in their questions. But Alan, I really appreciated your kind of main goal in this term of disruption and how we can do that in different spaces. What are some suggestions that you have for our audience, whether they're clinicians, individuals with lived experiences, or community members? Maybe some two or three kind of takeaways on how we can be disruptors in the spaces that we operate in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best ways is thinking outside of the box.
Mhm.
Thinking creatively about how we can share information as organizations, for example, not always just relying on text and books, but how can we think creatively? Can we use art forms like comic books? Can we use acting and improvisation exercises as ways to start these conversations? For example, one of the projects that I just got funding for, we're going to be co-creating comic books with autistic folks. And that's one way of helping people navigate intimate relationships and those nuances, but in a way that is much more accessible and feels much more welcoming rather than papers. Another amazing example is that we have a podcast series that is coming out again this month, and that is especially targeted for caregivers. One thing we learned about caregivers is that, I mean, they're busy. They're advocating for their, children with disabilities. They have so much on their plate. So we very humbly asked caregivers and like, how can we reach you? How can we give you this information, but in a way that works for you? And the best advice we got was create a podcast, because then when I'm driving my son, to school or my somewhere, I can just listen to it and make it no more than like 25 minutes. And we listened to that. We took that into account. So every episode is like 25 minutes long, plain language, and it's something that they can listen at any point in time. So I think thinking outside of the box and engaging with stakeholders to really know what works for you, and we'll go and try it. I think that's the best way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Alan, you're really highlighting the importance of community-based and community-partnered work, right? We got to be in the places where our communities and the people we serve are in order to improve access, change the narrative, and to really disseminate. I think that that's such an important point. So I guess we'll all stay tuned for that upcoming podcast and, stay up to date with your social media. Um, let's see here, some other really wonderful questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Maybe we'll start here. Alan, how do you handle families who, are beginning to start these conversations, or at what
Mhm.
age maybe should we start to broach this topic of sexuality for our clients? What would you recommend maybe for the practitioners in the audience?
That's a great question. It's wonderful when parents come to you asking for supports and they take that initiative, but it's not always the case. I think one of the biggest challenges is just parents or caregivers that don't feel like they have the tools or language to do these conversations or have these conversations. Also, the other piece is a lot of myth busting. So I think my biggest advice, first of all, is myth busting. Use that research, translate the research we know to parents. For example, one of the misconceptions that I see still so often among parents is that there's still this belief that if you talk about sexuality with people with disabilities, that they will just go and have sex right away. Where we know, however, that the literature says that people who receive information and are informed about this, they actually tend to delay sex because they're making better, more informed decisions about that, right? So it's a lot about flipping the script and myth busting. I think there are lots of parents who really just don't have the confidence or the tools to have these conversations. So sometimes it's me connecting people with resources, with books or comic books or ways to facilitate these conversations. I'm a firm believer that it's never too early to start these conversations, and it just needs to be appropriate to the age group that we're talking about. So for example, children, I think it's important that they still understand the parts of their bodies and being able to protect themselves and have boundaries, like what is okay and what is not okay. That is a conversation that we still don't have enough with children with disabilities, right? And setting those boundaries, being able to articulate what parts of the body, what they're called, what is their real names. So I think it's never too early to start giving age appropriate information.
Absolutely. Right. Are there specific resources that you tend to recommend or like to, frequently refer to for refer for families?
Yeah, there are so much now, right? There are comic books, and I'm happy to share some after. But there are lots of comic books. There's one called Disability and Sexuality. There's one book that is amazing, The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability, which I really recommend as well. Now there are some other podcasts like Disability After Dark that talks about intersections of queerness and disability. So usually when I, share these resources, it's resources that are actually created by people with lived experience, and that's where I think it's the best part. People with disabilities are not just sitting and waiting, but I think people are producing some really amazing creative materials out there. So the encouraging part, I think, for practitioners is that we don't need to recreate the wheel. There's a lot out there already. It's just a matter of how do we mobilize some of that. Or even in the website for Disability Sexuality Lab, we share lots of like toolkits and things that we are creating, and especially co-creating with people with lived experience. So those are some of the ones that I like to indicate.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to our audience that Dr. Martino's slides will be available on our website. And so we'll get access to, the resources that he mentioned and to, or at least direct them to your lab's website so that way they can get access to those websites. Um, Here's another question. I think I'm going to condense a couple questions that I'm seeing here is how to maybe tailor some of this content to different developmental needs or communication levels and abilities. Any recommendations that you have that speak to that, Alan?
Absolutely. Again, thinking outside of the box, right? So one of the research projects that we're doing right now is with autistic folks here in Alberta. And we wanted to do sex education, basically, but in a more creative way. So in consultations with an advisory group with lived experience, we came up with like, what are some arts-based approaches that we can use to engage with multiple kinds of communication and ways that people express themselves? So we decided to do a series of workshops. Each one is going to use a different art form. So for example, one of them is just going to be about writing. So if people, that's the best way for them to express themselves, that's great. There's another one is going to be improvisation exercises, so more like oral kind of skills. And there's another one that is going to be like hands-on. If you want to create a sculpture, if you want to like, so I think it's really the onus is on us to start thinking outside of the box and giving people more choices of how to engage, how to share their experiences. Even when we do interviews for research with people with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, we need to give people more choices, right? For example, maybe they might want to answer questions through email by typing and take their time. Maybe they want to have someone in the room with them during the interviews to facilitate that process of communication as well, someone who knows them a little bit better. So for me, it's really about like, how do we create a space where we listen to people and what works best for them? So sometimes it's just a matter of asking, what is the best way to engage? Like, what is the best way to give you this information as well?
Absolutely. I love that reminder again to think outside of the box and to teach people the ways that they learn best, because there's no one way, right? As we know,
Mhm.
and it's so beautiful to have multiple options to express ourselves and to educate others. Um, how about, let's see if this question here, um, maybe Alan, for our practitioners, if how we can navigate some of these tougher conversations if maybe parents are resistant to
Mhm.
um, you know, having conversations about sexuality and these kinds of topics are uncomfortable. How do you recommend, handling those types of situations?
Yeah, in situations like that I've been brought in sometimes to facilitate. I think we have a commitment to the people we work with, to people with disabilities, to stand up, right, alongside them and support them in advocating for their right to get information, to have some kind of access to the lives that they want to lead and to have. So I think first of all, we need to center that person in the conversation instead of having that as a side conversation or, a non-central voice. So for me, that's how I always start these conversations. Parents, caregivers have an important role to play, and we need to support them as well. Myth busting, giving them information, right? They're giving them the space, the resources. But at the end of the day, it's really about people with disabilities that we are here to support, right? And we have this commitment to delivering evidence-based information. It's really scary, like the number of people with intellectual disabilities in the community that have received like wrong information about sexuality and their sexual rights. People who were told, for example, that they had to be like 40 to be allowed to get married, or people who were told that if they ever had sex, that they would get pregnant automatically and immediately, right? So there's a lot of misinformation happening, and I think practitioners, we have a responsibility to support people, right? And be an advocate for making sure the information is evidence-based and that people have choices in this process. The last thing I'll say here too, that I've seen that is very scary, and I think practitioners play a very important role, is birth control. The number of women with intellectual disabilities that I've seen being put on birth control at a very early age, even if they're not sexually active, is a little concerning, not because of the birth control part of it. That's not the problem. The problem is when women are being put on birth control without being told that this is birth control, or being included in the decision-making process of whether or not they want, what kind of method works for them, what are the potential side effects. So the number of women that I've seen also who had been told, you know, that dirty time of the month, let's make it go away. I'll give you the shot and it will just not happen. That to me is a perfect opportunity for a practitioner to come into place using plain language and evidence-based information to really jump in and offer facts, right?
Absolutely, right. So really coming back to our goals and our jobs really to educate and to make those informed decisions, whatever individuals decide to do, right? But it's our job to disseminate that evidence-based information. Absolutely. I'm wondering, Alan, in our next couple of minutes, if you could share, based on the results of this study and your ongoing work, what some of your next steps and research priorities are for your lab. In addition to the podcast and the comic books that you're working on, what are some next steps and priorities that you're looking ahead to?
Yeah, there's always so little time, but so many fun projects. And I count myself as very lucky to be engaged working with amazing community partners and students. So we have the project around comic books for folks, autistic folks in the community. Okay. There's also the other project that we're working on creating resources for parents and caregivers of autistic youth and children as well about how to start conversations about sex and sexuality. So that will be very interesting. And some really fun projects. Another one is about online dating among people with disabilities. We know that more and more people with disabilities are using the spaces and navigating very unique questions. For example, should I disclose my disability if I have an invisible one? At what point should I do that? How do I navigate sometimes, experiences that are pretty negative and moments of rejection? How do I kind of sell myself in those apps and websites? So that's a really fun project. And the last one I would highlight, I'm working with my student as well, where we're going to be interviewing content creators with disabilities on OnlyFans. We know that there's a growing number of these people with disabilities entering the space and creating content, partially because it's inaccessible. They can choose work hours, they can work from home. Some people find a pleasurable experience, some people feel forced into it, all kinds of motivations. But we really want to understand from people with lived experiences, what are the motivations? What are their experiences like? What are the pros and cons of this experience? So we try to tackle everything. Nothing is a taboo topic for us. And we just want to understand people's experiences.
Absolutely. I love how you're modeling for us. Like nothing is taboo. Like things exist in the world, whether or not we acknowledge them, and we should be more open about them, especially when it comes to the world of disabilities, right? We make
Mhm.
such an effort for plain language and being open and prioritizing communication. So I really value you being here presenting to our community, Dr. Martino. It's really been such a pleasure hosting you. Maybe if we can put up that slide with your contact information and where we can find your lab and your wonderful work. And again, to our audience, Dr. Martino's slides and the recording for today's lecture will be available on our website in just a couple of weeks, so please do stay tuned. Um, Again, please do fill out our evaluation survey so that way I can, continue to be booking wonderful speakers just like Dr. Martino who are doing the good work, focused on the lecture topics that you are interested in, right? This is all community-based and partnered work. And so we have Dr. Martino's email address there, alan.martino@ucalgary.ca, and then the Disability Sexuality Lab website. All right. Thank you again, Dr. Martino. It's been such a pleasure having you. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you
Thanks for
again.
having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right, wonderful. Okay, and so to our audience, thank you for being here. Again, it is an optional opportunity for this next half hour to attend our research and resource exchange. Today we have our wonderful Dr. Catherine Lord, who is a distinguished professor of psychiatry here at UCLA and a member of our Tarjan faculty. She'll be presenting on a couple of her research studies. Thank you, Dr. Lord, for being here with us today. I'm going to hand things over to you, okay?
Yes. So I need to, let's see, I have a new computer, you guys. So somewhere on here are the slides. Oh, I just saw them. They flashed by. I need to share my screen, and there we go. And then, all right, can you guys, oh, no, I haven't hit the share button. There we go. Did that work?
There we go. Yep.
All right. So everybody, I'm just going to give you a brief description of what we do in our lab and the things, in particular, things where we're recruiting families and participants and adults. But I'm also happy to answer questions. And I have a million things on my screen right now, which I'm not used to, but I will hopefully be able to manage this. And thank you, Dr. Martino, for a wonderful talk. So the major project in our group is a project where we're not recruiting participants, but we've been following a group that started out as 254 two-year-olds referred for possible autism who are now 33 years old. And we've been able to see them in person about 6 times since they were 2, and also been able to get questionnaires and phone interviews about every 3 to 6 months. So we have a ton of data on these families. There are now about 150 of them. They are not here. They're in Chicago or the suburbs, in North Carolina and in Michigan. And what's nice about our sample, there's both really good things and not so good things, is it's not wealthy people. They were all associated with free assessments through the community. So it's definitely working class families, very few people in very severe poverty, but families who did bring their 2-year-old to a clinic to get assessed. And about 20% of the sample we have never thought they had autism. So, but we've hung on to them as well, which has been interesting. So what we're doing now is still following the families. We have many to go out and see them, and to actually both study the caregivers who are now in their 60s, some moving in their 70s. So looking particularly at their health and mental health, but also the people that were thought to possibly have autism. And in this sample, it's also very different than what you'd get in terms of people who'd walk into a clinic today, because about 60% of the sample of the participants, so this is not parents, but the people that were 2-year-olds who are now 33, are quite intellectually disabled, minimally verbal. Many have some language, but not a ton. So quite delayed and have very different issues and circumstances than the other 40% who, this is really a very separate sample with very few people in the middle. The other 40% tend to have average intelligence, and many have gone to college. We do have about 25% of the people with average intelligence who really you would not say had autism today, although they can use that diagnosis if they want. Some of them still will say they have autism, and others will say they've moved beyond. We also have another 15% of that group who are doing very well. And although you would know that they had autism and they would tell you they have autism, they are employed and supporting themselves. and many, well, less often in relationships, but some in relationships. And so really describing their lives as good, but we also have in that group about I think it's less than 50% of people with average intelligence who are really struggling, who many went to college but are having trouble finding or keeping jobs, are still living with their parents, um, and really needing support and able to do many, many things, but still having very clear difficulties. So we're currently within that project, we're looking at the caregivers a lot and how they're doing. We're particularly interested in housing because that is such an issue, both for the families who have individuals who are minimally verbal, who cannot live independently, but also for the autistic adults who have not launched and who many would really like to live somewhere else. We also have a very specific project about puberty because we really tortured these poor families from the time the kids were about 10 or 11 up until into their 20s, where we had them give us data every 3 months so we can look at changes in behavior associated with puberty. And we are very interested in figuring out better how to assess people with autism and with significant intellectual disabilities, quite severe disabilities. So not somebody with an IQ of 50, but somebody who is minimally verbal and has autism, because there's a lot of interest in aging and what will happen to these people as they get older, but it's quite hard to have baseline data. And then I'll talk about it in a separate study, but we're also very interested in the families and have maintained relationships, thank goodness for these families, with the siblings of the autistic kids who are now mostly grown. So let's see if I can move a slide. So I think one of the things we are looking for is we would love to talk to autistic people who are 50 or older, or families with a family member who has autism, who is 50 or older, because it's such an unknown topic. And our group, where I feel like I know a lot from the people that we've known up to age 33, and then I don't know things. And so we're inviting people to contact us, and what we'd like to just do is have probably virtual, but we could do in person focus groups, or just a chance to see where people are and what it is that you want, because a lot of people think they know what you want, but I don't know, and that would be important. Okay. Another thing we are doing that is branching out of the longitudinal study, but is not the same, is Autism Science Foundation is very interested in a project called Next Gen SIBS. And that is really not baby SIBS. So it's not studying younger siblings of kids who have diagnoses of autism, but studying the siblings of studying the children of typical siblings of autistic kids. And partly this was really initiated, I think, by grandparents who wanted somebody to be there to support their non-autistic kids as they were having children, and just to see what arises and the degree to which autism occurs. And if that happens, can we help you faster? So this is a project where, again, we will come to you. We're interested. We're supposed to start with babies who are between 6 and 18 months of age. So if anybody knows someone who is pregnant, who is or has a 6 to 18-month-old who is a sibling of an autistic adult, who would like to participate in this, we will come to you again. Some can be virtual, and we also can travel. And we're just interested in monitoring your child's development and hearing your thoughts about what's happening. And we've been able to do this with a fair number of the siblings of our longitudinal study, but we can open it up to anybody who is interested. And that's a study that's being run by Nicole Rosen. Let me see, did I miss something? No. Other things we're doing, we're very interested in trying to figure out if there are better ways of measuring progress in social communication in autistic children and adults, and particularly ways that go beyond parents filling out questionnaires, or therapists filling out questionnaires. So we've developed something that we call the BOSC, which is a video of a child or an adult interacting with someone else. It can be their parent, it can be a friend, it can be one of our research assistants. And it just takes 12 to 14 minutes. They're different things that they do that you do depending on how old you are and how much language you have. And what we're hoping is that eventually we can work with someone who can help us do automated coding of this, which would mean that a person doesn't have to watch the video and tick off how often you looked at each other, but that you could use machine learning and AI to keep track of things so that people could use this, even families or therapists could use this as an independent measure of change over several months. We know that we can monitor change over years with something like an ADOS, but it doesn't work for brief changes. And we also know that a lot of different studies have their own measures of change, which is great. And they can say our study teaches joint attention, and on a joint attention measure, the child gets better. But we want to have something broader that can be done across a variety of studies. So that's what the BOSC is. And that's something we're doing. We also carried out a study, which is where the data is collected, where we looked at administering the ADOS in Spanish and in English to kids who are bilingual here in LA. And we were interested, having come from New York to here. In New York, if your child is exposed to another language, you have to have them tested in that language in order to get a diagnosis. And sometimes that is really valuable, but sometimes it's not. And so we wanted to know how important is that and when is it important? And that is something we're working on right now. As far as we can tell, the kids who look autistic, both in Spanish and in English, but it does seem like there are differences for the families, particularly if the family members speak one language or the other. And we're interested in assessment with Spanish-speaking populations. In addition, Dina Gohari, one of the graduate students, is very interested in identity development in gender diverse autistic youth and adults, and so is doing a study interviewing adults who are gender diverse about their experiences and how did they sort out what it is they wanted and what has been hard and what has gone well and made it different. We are the clinical core, so we're doing the assessments for several studies that Connie Kassery is involved in that use different intervention techniques with minimally verbal children. And we're also working with a person named Daniel Messenger in Miami to do multimodal assessment of kids with autism in preschool classes. And so Daniel has kids wearing various little gadgets to show how much the autistic kids interact with different people, including their peers. And we're also doing the BOSC before and after and the ADOS. And then we are looking for, we are we are with the ADOS, which is a standard measure that some of you have probably heard of, that's part of diagnosis. We're trying to develop a somewhat different set of tasks for very verbal younger kids, because right now those kids get given a version that's really intended for older kids, and you end up having bizarre conversations with them about whether they're going to get married or something, which is not very appropriate. So that's going on within our group. And this is here. We are able to pay people if you have a child who is 8 years old or younger, who is can talk in complex sentences. So they have to be able to say more than simple phrases, and will let us work with them. And that is something that, again, we can come to you. It will take about an hour and a half, maybe, by the time we get all set up. We would also do some quick measures of receptive language and behavior, just so that we can describe your child. But that is something, and actually, if you're interested, probably the best thing to do is just contact me, which I'm not on this, but which is CLORD, CLORD at mednet.ucla.edu. Okay, whoops. And I think that's my list of what we're doing. I'm happy to talk to anybody who has questions. Jasper, are you, or comments? I should say we're not recruiting anybody, but both the ADOS and ADI are undergoing major revisions. The ADI we're trying to make shorter. This is the parent interview, so I'm sure many people would be happy with us if it can be shorter. And get it into an hour long, and also have different modules so that you could use it if you need to have a history. You could use one form if you don't need a history and just want to know how a child is doing now, so to compare with other data, you could do a different form. And then the ADOS is not changing radically, but we are, the formal version, which WPS will sell, will include calibrations and the adapted ADOS, and also better data. So we hope going forward that will help. Anyway, sorry, Jasper, I sort of half turned it over to you and half didn't.
No, it's okay. It's good to see you, Kathy. And thank you so much for sharing about the multiple ongoing studies within your lab. It's always great to see the work that you and your team are doing and continue to do for the autistic community. To our audience, if you have questions for Dr. Lord about any of the studies, recruitment, or contact information, please feel free to continue to type those into the chat. But maybe, Kathy, if you want to go back a slide or two to one that has contact information, I'll also put your email address into the chat too.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So for Next Gen SIBS, this is the study looking at infants of adult siblings of autistic individuals. And so if you're interested in that study, you can contact Nicole Rosen. There is a QR code there, and our email address is nrosen, that's ROSEN at mednet.ucla.edu. Are there other studies too?
Or here's Juliet.
And then for the study, really, really interesting, looking at autistic individuals above the age of 50, you can contact Juliet Lerner. Her email address is jelerner@mednet.ucla.edu. And then I believe, Kathy, there's the gender diverse study, isn't there also?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if people are interested in that, contact me,
Okay.
because Dina didn't make a slide, but I can put you in touch with Dina. So it's just the same as N Rosen, only put CLORD as the first 5 letters.
Great, thank you, Kathy. There is a question here about adapting the ADOS to not include questions about marriage with younger children. I think there's just some clarifying question, a clarifying question there about, what kinds of updates or if people should stay tuned for that.
Yes, stay tuned. I think that we do have a list. So if somebody's interested, they can contact me and I can send you the recommendations for what you should do. Because we have over the years in trainings made recommendations because this is a problem. But basically what we've done is combine module 2 with module 3. So there are more fun things, like we still do the bubbles and the balloons because you're with younger kids and the snack. So you want to give them a break and you want to make it lighter and less of this serious conversation. But you still do ask them about emotions. You still ask them about friends. And then we've changed a few of the codes. That are just hard to make if you're not doing the cartoons. So that won't make any sense to people who are not giving ADOSs, but the idea is just to use common sense to make it less onerous for a very young child. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of conversation once you get to,
Yeah.
that part of the ADOS. Great. All right. To our audience, I did type in Dr. Lord's email address into the chat, so that's available there if you have any questions. Of course, you're welcome to reach out to the Tarjan Center too. Another reminder to please complete our evaluation survey, so that way we can continue to provide these lectures and make sure that we're responding to the topics that you're interested in. Thank you again to Dr. Martino for being here, calling in from Canada, which is such a pleasure to have him. And then thank you again to Dr. Lord for being here and continuing to do this amazing work supporting our autistic community. All right.
Thanks, everybody. And hi, Dr. Martino. I lived in Edmonton for 10 years, so hi to Calgary.
Amazing, we're neighbors.
Yeah.
All right. Be safe and be well, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next month for our next Tarjan lecture. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Jasper.
Thank you, Kathy. Bye.